This is John Crook interviewing Seni Seneviratne for New Cultural Voices Oral History Project in Sheffield on Tuesday, 12th of February 2013. Seni, can you tell us a little bit about your family background?
Yes, I was born in Leeds in the 1950s, and my mother was from Yorkshire, born and bred in Yorkshire, and my father was from Sri Lanka, which was then known as Ceylon. He'd been in Leeds since he was a boy. He'd been at school there, and my mother and father had met through the Catholic Church, in fact. Yeah, I was one of 4 children, and well, for a long time I was the youngest of 3, and then my younger sister came along 9 years later. We grew up in a Leeds that was there were very few black families really that I kind of knew or were around in the area that I lived in, and it was very unusual to have a mixed race family really. My mother used to tell stories about when my brother, who was the eldest, when she was pregnant with him, that you know, she'd overheard people saying, well, I wonder what it'll be like, I wonder what it'll, you know, what she'll have, kind of thing, what will he be like? And this friend of hers who'd overheard it had said, well, he'll have 10 fingers and 10 toes, what do you think? You know, so there was those kind of stories that used to go around. And my grandmother used to tell stories, actually, my mum's mum, about how people used to come knocking on her door. One day somebody came and knocked on her door and said, I've just seen your daughter in town with a black man. And she said, yes, I know, he's sitting in my room now having a cup of tea. And so my sense was that my mum's family were it wasn't a problem for them at all. And you know, they just kind of dealt with it really. They just dealt with what would have been probably you know, people's what would you say, kind of disapproval maybe, or
prejudice
really, yeah. And I think that my mother must have been an incredibly brave woman. They were married, I mean, they were together before my dad. My dad fought in the British Army, so I think they must have got engaged before he went to the war, and they got married in 1946 when he came back. And I think my mum must have been quite a kind of brave, feisty young woman, really, to think, well, that's what I'm going to do, and I don't care what people say. So she was quite rebellious in that way, really. I think I get some of my rebellious spirit from her, although she didn't enjoy my rebellious spirit very much. So yeah, I grew up in a mixed race family, and the family was mainly, the extended family was my mum's family, kind of Yorkshire working class family, a lot of love and loyalty and good wholesome food and that kind of thing. I didn't really see very much of my dad's family. My dad's mum had died when he was very young, and his father had married again and was living back in Ceylon. I only saw him probably once, actually, in my life, when I was about 5 years old. So it was a kind of... I lived and grew up in Yorkshire, and Ceylon was this place that was in picture books, really. It was a place that my dad didn't talk a lot about it, but my grandfather's second wife used to send these magazines that had all these pictures of Ceylon in them, and I can remember looking at these books and feeling it as this like really magical place, and so it was a bit of a sort of dream place in a way. And then there was real life in Yorkshire. I think they were... I think it was the religion, actually. You know, for them, it was like, this boy's a Catholic. You know, he's gone to a good Catholic school. He's grown up with all of us. He's been part of, you know, the kind of group of young people that have all been around together. So he's just one of us in a way. I think that was how they saw it. And I think it goes even further back in my family, because actually my grandfather, his second wife that he married in 1928 was a young Yorkshire woman, and her parents, again, this kind of working class family from Leeds, I'm amazed that they kind of, because she married my grandfather and went back to Ceylon with him, and her father must have been an incredibly free thinker, really, to just sort of say, yeah, fine, yeah. So this connection between Yorkshire and Ceylon goes right back to the 1920s, really, and there's been all this kind of intermarriage, if you like. My dad, I think my grandfather thought my dad would go back to Ceylon, and he was kind of probably hoping he would marry somebody from there and kind of live there. But my dad had already met my mum by then. And then my uncle, who was from his second marriage, he also came over to England to go to college, and then he met a woman from Yorkshire and he married her. So there's been this kind of interrelationship between Ceylon, Sri Lanka and Yorkshire for many, many years, really, which I feel is a very rich heritage that I have. I don't feel like it hasn't really ever felt to me like a disadvantage at all to have that, really. I think the biggest thing about me being, particularly being a writer, being a poet, I'm not sure where it comes from. It's interesting that my grandfather, my father's father, was himself a poet, and I do know, and I've come to appreciate more the fact that my father really loved poetry, liked to recite poetry, and my father was very eloquent. I know that he was quite involved in the Catholic Church, and he gave lots of speeches at various events and things. So he was a very good speech writer, very good at crosswords. So he had a love of language, and although my mother wasn't, she wasn't as kind of literary or literate as my father. She'd had to leave school early because she came from quite not a very well off working class family, and she'd had to stay at home to help her mum look after a sick relative. So I think she gave me something else, really. In fact, what she gave me was my love of singing, because she was a beautiful singer, and I used to listen to her singing while she was doing the housework, and that's something else that I do now. So as well as being a poet, I'm also a singer. So I think I got those two things from each of them. Well, they wanted us all to do well, and they wanted us to have advantages that they'd not had. And because we grew up, we all came to a kind of university sort of age at a time when it didn't cost a lot of money to go to university. All four of us were able to go to university, and I often think now that if in the current situation, my father would never have been able to afford to do that. He wasn't kind of incredibly well off, so that was a big advantage for us, really. So he wanted us to take advantage of the education system, and he wanted us to do well and get good jobs and do all of those kinds of things. And so the idea of me being a kind of an artist and not really having a career as such wouldn't have appealed to him, really. And I'm the only one out of all four of us who took that path, really. All the others kind of got into something as a career that they pursued, whereas I've always done work as a way of financing what I really want to do, which is to be an artist of some kind. Yeah. Well, I would say, one of the sad things is that the first publication that I had, I did it with two other women in Sheffield, two other Asian women in Sheffield, and it came out in 1989, and my father had died in 1988, and so he never actually saw that. When I took it to my mum, she was really pleased and proud of it, actually. And it's quite interesting because it was a book of poems and photographs, and some of the poems were a bit, I mean, it was a long time ago, and some of the poems now I'd think, oh my God, they need editing, whatever. But, you know, they were there, they were raw, they were out on the page. Some of them were a bit edgy. She kind of, I remember her saying, oh, I showed this to, the parish priest came around to visit us and I showed him it and I was really proud of it. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, I wonder what he thought of it, you know. So she was really, really proud of it. It didn't kind of seem to matter to her what the content was. It was the fact that I'd actually done it and I got it out. There was one poem in there that was about my father's death. He was only 70 when he died. He died of cancer. And she asked me about it, and yeah, she was very kind of moved by it and everything, and asked me why I'd never showed her it before and all of those sorts of things. So yeah, I think it was, I think she was proud of me, actually. Yeah, I think she was. I've always been very involved in, I've always been an activist, and always had this big desire to change the world and to make the world a better place. For me, it's inevitable that becomes part of everything that I do. That becomes part of my writing as well. So although I'm not, I want to write about things. Things happen, and I want my writing to be a response. When I was growing up, my poetry was my way of dealing with the world, or dealing with what was happening for me, or things to do with my identity, or this idea of not belonging. You know, never ever feeling like I belonged anywhere properly, or was never truly accepted anywhere. Even though I was born in Leeds, you know, I could be out and people would look at me as if I wasn't from there. I guess for me, the extension of that is that something major happens in the world that has an impact on me, and I want to bear witness to that in some way. But I don't want it to be a political speech. I don't want it to be a polemic. I want it to be a lyric. I want it to be a piece of poetry kind of thing. So I want to have a poetic response to things that are very, people might think are not very poetic. Things like conflict, trauma, war. I want to have a poetic response to it, and I think it's an enormous challenge. I used to read the war poets a lot when I was younger. You know, that was my first sort of, and actually, a bit like my father copying out The Highwayman, I used to hand write out, you know, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen poems, and you know, I've still got this book with all these handwritten poems. So it is an interest that I've always had in trying to find a way of expressing horror through poetry. And the reason I think it's important is because I think there's a long history of poets being, well, Shelley said, poets are the true legislators of the world. That they're the ones who try and change people's hearts, rather than change people's minds or something, or as well as changing people's minds. And so that's my motivation, really. It comes from inside, me needing to do something, me needing to respond. And then the challenge is, how do I respond in a way that is not, that is poetic and is not over sentimental and is not cliched? How do I find a way of responding to, you know, the war in Iraq, for instance, by, you know, through a poem? And I try different ways of doing that, and one of the ways I responded to that in my latest book was by writing a poem in the voice of the mother of a returning US soldier who committed suicide, and you know, it feels like that's a way of saying something that's important for people to hear, but a different way of saying it, really. Yeah. I'm very proud of being from Yorkshire, particularly when I'm not in Yorkshire. It is important because of what I said before about this connection that there's been over many years in my family between Yorkshire and somewhere really far away from Yorkshire and very different to Yorkshire. And something about the kind of something about this the you mentioned before about these people who seem to be very accepting of difference and of people coming along and marrying their daughters, you know, people from halfway across the world coming along and getting married to their daughters and not seeming to have there's something about a kind of down-to-earth approach to things somehow that seems to have been there in my family. And I've always kind of felt it's really important to value, I think there was a period of time in the 70s, maybe in the 80s, when people of mixed heritage, there was this kind of sense that you had to deny the sort of side of your family that was of white heritage or something, and not be proud of it somehow, and only claim your black roots, if you like. And it's always been important to me to see the importance of everything about my family and the really positive things that I think I got from that kind of Yorkshire working class roots that I grew up in and, you know, was around me, and those values that must have been there actually in the family, that I've kind of taken on board. So yeah, it is important to me. But the other thing is that they were very traditional, and I'm not traditional at all. So there's like a tension there, and I think the tension is what breeds creativity in a way. Because if everything's all just running smoothly, then there's no pull really to have to do something different. So it is that sort of tension between this very kind of close, loving family that I also felt the need to get away from, to be myself and to grow in the way that I needed to. So, you know, I went away from Yorkshire to Essex University because I wanted to go to one of the new universities. I didn't want to go to anything that anybody approved of. I didn't want to go, you know, to one of the kind of traditional universities. And I did it out of a sense of, well, I want to do something different. And I studied sociology because I wanted to do something different, even though I'd done English, Latin and French A-levels, and you would have thought I might have gone into something more kind of arts, in the arts kind of side, really. So I did lots of things that were about breaking out of that, which I had to do in order to make sense of who I was, and then to sort of piece things back. It was almost like breaking out, throwing everything aside, and then saying, okay, now what do I want? What makes sense for me? What are my values? Yes, I am spiritual, but I don't want to be a Catholic anymore. I don't believe in all of that. I need to remake it, kind of recreate it in a way that makes sense for me. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's quite late on that I've discovered that I've got all these other creative kind of things about me that I've never expressed. So I go back to my childhood, and I think when I was at school, I used to go to art classes, and and the teacher would say, okay, do a painting of this. And I'd sit there and I couldn't think of anything, and I couldn't think what to do, and I was like, get totally stressed about it, and then end up not doing anything. I thought I was no good at art, so when it came to making my choices about subjects, I did biology instead of art, because that was the choice you were given, and I thought, well, I'll be able to do biology. And now I realise is that was because they weren't really helping us to play, they weren't helping us to like play with the materials and be creative with them. They were just telling you to do something on a blank piece of paper. And when I do writing workshops now, the big thing that I always stress is that it's not about having a blank piece of paper, now you must write something. It's about learning how to play with words. And I think what I'm now having this benefit of doing is being in different situations where I'm learning how to play with other materials besides language, really. Because I've always done that with language, but now being able to get a big lump of clay and play with that, or some paints and play with them, is just, it's just great. So it kind of makes me feel a bit sad about that little girl who could have probably benefited a lot from doing all those things. Because I was quite, when I was, probably wouldn't believe it, but I was very, very shy when I was a child. And it took me a long time to sort of work through all of that. And I just think if I'd have had some of those different ways of expressing myself, maybe it would have been a bit of an easier ride, I guess. But anyway, I've got there now, so.
Seni, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.